Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us to discuss the final proposal for Phase 1 of the Resource Adequacy Enhancements Initiative. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by our three presenters, Carl Musin, Gabe Murtaugh, and Bridget Sparks from Infrastructure and Regulatory Policy. Also on the line from Policy, we have Greg Cook and Milos Bosinek. And then I'm also joined on the line by a few of our subject matter experts who will be available to answer questions as needed. The paper and presentation that we will be discussing during today's call are available on the initiative webpage on the ISO website. And before we get started, I just wanted to go through a few reminders. Today's call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be represented without the ISO's permission. In addition, these calls are structured to stimulate an honest dialogue and engage different perspectives with the expectation that stakeholders have read the proposal. While we always welcome and encourage comments and questions, please be sure to keep them friendly and respectful. We did solicit questions in advance of today's call. However, we did not receive any. Therefore, we will be addressing questions submitted through the WebEx chat feature, which is located on the bottom right-hand side of the screen first. And then if time permits, we will accept verbal questions and comments. However, time limits may be used to ensure we hear from all stakeholders. And to enter the verbal question queue, you can do so by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. And then lastly, to ensure we manage our time today as efficiently as possible, just please refrain from repeating or reiterating questions or comments that have already been made. So the agenda for today's call, we're going to start off with planned outage process enhancements. So Carl will be presenting that topic. And then Gabe will present the operationalizing storage element of the proposal. And then finally, Bridget will be presenting the backstop capacity procurement element. And then we'll wrap up today with the next steps. So this slide here shows where we are at in the stakeholder process. We are in the final proposal stage of proposal development. And then this slide here outlines the different elements included in both Phase 1 and Phase 2 of this initiative. Today we'll be discussing the Phase 1 elements, which again include the initial enhancements to the ISO's planned outage process, operationalizing storage, and then backstop capacity authority for local area energy sufficiency. And we plan to seek board approval on these Phase 1 elements next month at the March Board of Governors meeting. And then Phase 2 of this initiative focuses on methodologies for calculating UCAP values for system, local, and flexible RA, setting minimum system RA requirements, system RA energy sufficiency testing, must offer obligations and bid insertion rules, additional modifications to the ISO backstop capacity procurement provisions and planned outage process, and then finally RA import provisions. And as you can see, this schedule has been modified from the last iteration of the paper to provide additional time to engage with stakeholders as well as the CPUC and to align the schedule with the upcoming Maximum Import Capability Enhancements Initiative for the RA import topic, and also provide additional analysis to support UCAP and the UCAP-related topics. So therefore, we're now planning to seek board approval on the Phase 2 elements in September and November. And then here we are with the schedule. We posted the final proposal on February 17th. And we will be accepting comments on that proposal until March 9th, and then we will present those Phase 1 elements during the March 24th and 25th Board of Governors meeting. So with that, I will hand it over to Carl Musin, and we'll get started.
Okay, good afternoon. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great, thank you very much. So, I realized asking that question was a little silly since only a couple people can actually answer it. So thank you very much, Isabella, for going through the process and where we're at on things. Today, I'm going to focus not so much on the specifics of the proposal for planned outage enhancements. We've made a few minor modifications. Most of what we've done has been clarifications and responses to stakeholder comments, and that's really what I want to focus on today, just to make sure that, we're all on the same page. I understand that there, again, are going to be some disagreements with the position that the ISO is taking on this front. However, we have done our best to respond to the comments that have come in and let all parties know where we're standing on this issue. If we can go to the next slide. So again, we continue to work on a two-phased approach for planned outage substitution. Today's discussion is going to focus on phase one. The proposal at a high level will require all planned outages for RA resources to bring full substitute capacity for the outage to be approved. Again, there's a little bit of clarification in there, which is to say that the replacement obligation will be for the capacity that has gone on outage, not necessarily for the entirety of the resource. Additionally, it is full substitution for the requested outage. We considered whether or not to have some sort of, hey, you got close enough standard. However, when we looked at this, because we have shaped monthly RA requirements, we thought that maintaining that standard of 100% of the RA that's going on planned outage will be replaced, ensuring that the month-by-month RA obligations and requirements continue to be fulfilled on an everyday basis. Additionally, the requested planned outage extensions or modifications to planned outages, we'll be looking to treat those a little bit differently than we do today, which is to say those extension requests will be treated as separate outages, and those will also require substitute capacity for those planned outages to be approved. If they do not have substitute capacity, those outages would be considered forced. Again, our goal here is to recognize that changes need to be made in our planned outage process as identified in our root cause analysis for the August events, as well as what we've heard from stakeholders over time. We recognize, too, that this is not the end solution. This is a first step to help ensure reliability as we roll into and prepare for summer 2021, and we build the longer-term solution in phase two. So what we've got here is very focused and much more readily implementable proposal so that we can have something in place for summer 2021. Let's go to the next slide. So again, I put here the overarching objectives and principles for our planned outage process modifications. We understand that sometimes these principles or objectives are not necessarily or may at times seem mutually exclusive or not necessarily fully compatible with one another or the ISO's initial proposal. That was a point that was raised by stakeholders. We'll get to that in a moment. But the goal really is to encourage the resources to report their outages as soon as possible. We like to avoid denying any approved planned outages. So once outages have come in and been conditionally approved, we don't want to have to go back and say, well, there was not a substitution, there's not the necessary RA capacity available to us, so we're going to have to actually subsequently deny that outage. We're trying to avoid that. We do want to identify specific replacement requirements for resources that require replacement. So again, having clarity about what it is that resources have to provide and by when. We want to include the development of an ISO system for procuring replacement capacity. Again, that's a phase two element. We've not gotten into that here. We are looking at the planned outage replacement pool that was discussed in the draft final / sixth revised straw proposal as part of phase two of this initiative, and that's going to be what we're looking at as kind of the longer term solution. That'll be a much more complicated lift to design and implement. And then finally, minimize or eliminate the need to require substitute capacity to the greatest extent possible. Again, this is part of our longer term objective, is to try and make sure that this capacity is lined up ahead of time so that we have a better planned system and outages are more easily accommodated for both reliability and for the resources themselves. go to the next slide. So I'm going to go through some of our clarifications that we've made here on this slide, and then I'm going to pause to see if there are any questions online. I'm not seeing any in the chat box at this point in time, so I just wanted to note that. And if I'm missing something, Isabella, please let me know if there are questions I'm missing. So again, we have tried to provide the specific responses to stakeholders. We'll get into, I think, what we saw as the 4 main headings of those concerns in a bit. But first, what we tried to do is address some specific clarifications. The planned enforced outage definitions that we had been using through the 5th and draft final straw proposal, where we're trying to align those with the RC definition. We've put that on hold, and for now, the outage definitions are going to continue to be as they are today, which is anything after T-8 will be defined as forced. Anything prior to T-8 is most likely planned. There are some unique scenarios in which it could be a forced outage, but by and large, we look at those probably being planned, and so we're going to leave those definitions as they are today to help add clarity to the proposal as it is. We were asked about grandfathering some of the outages that are conditionally approved today, meaning they would not be subject to this new POSO requirement. We are not going to propose grandfathering provisions. We still have, for the months we look at this being basically active for, we haven't done POSO yet. So we haven't looked to see what POSO obligations will be for the months of, say, June or July. And so therefore we just don't have any, we don't see any need at this point in time for grandfathering. Basically what this proposal will do is clarify that if we were to run POSO at 20 days prior to that month, your answer would come back as yes. So we don't see a need to grandfather those conditionally approved outages. There appeared to be a little bit of confusion about whether or not the substitution for RA resources was on the LSE or the resource SC. So if an LSE came in and had a resource trying to take a planned outage on it, showing what the LSE would need to do to show that substitute capacity was made available, the answer is nothing. The substitution obligation is on the resource SC, not on the LSE. The LSE has gone out, done its contracting, made its showing. The SC for the resources taking the planned outage, and therefore will be responsible for finding the substitute capacity. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the replacement obligation will be for the megawatts on outage, not for the whole resource, and only for the duration of the outage. If that outage is canceled, the ISO will release the substitute capacity from its RA obligation. There was a question also of whether or not the substitute capacity had to come from a resource or from a pool of resources. I think the answer on this one, because the ask was a little unclear, so we maybe got into a little bit additional detail on this one, but the substitute capacity must come from specified resource IDs or resource IDs. If one resource goes on outage, yes, you can use multiple resources to provide that substitute capacity, but you can't provide the ISO a collection of resource IDs and say, some of these will give you that much. We have to know where it's coming from. It has to be resource or resources specific, not just kind of an aggregation of a bunch of different resources. And then, again, clarifying that the proposal applies to all months starting summer 2021 and will sunset once the long-term solution is placed. This is not a summer-only requirement. Again, the RA requirements year-round float to the expected forecasted load. And so to the extent that we have RA obligations, we expect them to be fulfilled on a monthly basis. If you are an RA resource, you've been paid to provide a service, that service being availability. If you can't do it, find somebody who can. So again, we've tried to provide clarity based on what stakeholders have asked. There is a question on the chat line about an enhanced bulletin board. That is not going to be part of phase one. We will continue to contemplate the need for that in phase two. Our hope is that if we develop the planned outage replacement pool where all the substitute capacity is procured ahead of time, we can obviate the need for the bulletin board. But we are not planning on implementing or developing anything new for phase one of this proposal. Okay, I see another chat question has just come in. Let me. If a planned outage needs to be extended for 15 minutes, would the FC still be able to extend the outage under the current practice, or would it be required to submit a forced outage card for the additional 15 minutes? In other words, what granularity of extensions is expected? So my understanding on this, and Abdul, I'm going to ask you to fill in if I misstate anything. The outage information comes in, I think it's hourly, but I'm not positive on that. And so I don't know. Again, I think the requests for extensions are any intervals beyond the requested outage that's been submitted and is currently existing in OMS. Abdul, have I misstated anything there?
Yeah, so no, you're correct on how today we do it. It's the extensions are possible, and it's in OMS, and it could be by minutes, not necessarily by hour. But I think this one is referencing the policy change that prevents extension requests. So in this case, if the extension, even if it's for 15 minutes, we're not going to allow extensions, and they're going to have to submit a new outage card, even for those 15 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Abdul. So another question in the chat box: if the substitute resource becomes unavailable, who is responsible for doing something? The substitute resource is now taken over the RA obligation, including must offer and replacement obligations from the original resource. So that resource now also takes on the obligations to find substitute capacity. So the original resource will not be back on the hook until its initial outage is over again, or any contracted for outage replacement is over. And by starting summer 2021, yes, we're meeting June 1 is the current plan for this proposal to go live, or to be effective, I guess, is the correct term. Okay, so appreciate all the questions in the chat. I really appreciate this format. It really helps us manage time a little bit more effectively, but I want to make sure, have we addressed everyone's questions? If we have not, please feel free to queue up. Operator, do we have anybody on the phone queue?
Yes, I see one caller in the phone queue.
Okay, let's open that line quickly, please.
Sure. Caller line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Carl, it's Chris Devin from Customized Energy Solutions. Can you hear me?
Hey, Chris. Yep, we got you.
So I have actually two separate questions, sorry. One of them is on the kind of scope and the import rules change. And maybe we could address that one later, but on this proposal for the planned outages, I was just curious about how exactly it would work for a longer-term outage. If you had a supply plan and an LSE's RA plan, both with a resource on there that wanted to take a planned outage in the long term ahead of time, and then they actually didn't provide substitution, would both those plans get rejected, or would it just be only on the supply plan? Kind of, when you get into that first validation process at T45 for the RA showing time frame. Is that clear?
Yeah, I think so, Chris. So
okay.
Again, the obligations are on the SC for the resource to the extent that they do not provide substitute capacity. They're going to be on the hook for it, and any subsequent ramifications for that, for example, having that planned outage canceled, any, RAIN charges that might come with that or future UCAP penalties would be applied directly to that resource. So the LFP will not be on the hook for that. When it comes to that initial validation, we'll still see that resource on there because, again, that planned outage, I think, Abdul, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're giving them a day or two to actually get the substitute capacity in so we can do that initial validation at T-minus 45. So it all goes back to the resource owner.
Yeah, that's correct, Carl. About 24 hours window to fire the substitution. So in this example that Chris provided, the long-range outage would come in much, in advance of the RA showings. The RA plan, supply plan would come in, and we don't reject neither of them. We would, after the supply plan, RA plan come in, we start running the validation the next day. So the first time they'll see the clock will start ticking is at the next day, which is T-minus 44. They'll see that, obviously the substitution requirement, which they should know about as soon as they decide that they're going to put an RA, RA capacity on an outage, on a resource that has an outage. So, they know about it, months in advance, since maybe years, since this is a planned outage in the long-range process. But they'll see it after T-minus 44. They can submit the outage, and then they have a day to do it. And then after that, if it doesn't get submitted, then we deny the outage. We do not deny the supply plans or the RA plans. We only deny the outage stuff.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Yeah, I was just curious about exactly if it impacted the LSCs at all, but it's pretty clear you guys are really putting that obligation on the SC's supplier side. So thanks for that clarification. Then just the other quick question I had, hopefully to be quick, is just it's about the scoping stuff and the phases on kind of the import RA piece of it. I was just curious because that was in phase one. And, I think Isabella mentioned some things at the beginning which were somewhat helpful, but I just wanted to get a little bit more clarity on, the intent there. Is it really because you guys are trying to look at making some additional MIC enhancements through another initiative this summer, or are you also working with the PUC through that, their RA process, and that sort of gives some more time for that, and then maybe have it, any idea of potentially when you think that would be implemented for what RA year applicable that might be. Any information on that would be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, so
I can answer that, Carl.
Yeah.
Thanks. Good afternoon, Chris. Let's see. It was your second point. We are taking a little more time so that we can further coordinate with PUC and PUC process, given the extensive changes on RA imports. Right now, I think we're slating that would go to the board in November. So again, there's sort of these tranches, given how big the whole RA enhancements initiative is. We're trying to break it up into some pieces so that we can manage the process both at the board and FERC. And so I think to give more time at PUC in that process on RA imports, we're looking at November board, but we'd still be looking at that 2023 implementation. At this point, we're still focused on 2023 RA compliance here.
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarification. I appreciate it. And I just want to say I think it's good to see you guys taking a little bit more time on some of the other topics as well, to get some more, turns on the crank and some more feedback and stuff. So thanks for that. Okay.
You bet.
Okay. Great. So I want to go back to the chat line really quick because we got a couple more questions in there. Which tools are SCs expected to use to provide substitution between T-minus 45 and T-minus 8? If it is CIRA, when will BPM changes and new CIRA guidelines be published? Abdul, I'm going to turn to you on the actual tools that they'll be using, whether it's OMS or CIRA, to help clarify that question.
Yes, it is going to be CIRA. We're keeping the same process as it is today for providing substitution in CIRA under the substitution screen. So that's not changing. And yes, for BPM, there will be BPM updates to reflect this policy change. They're probably, timeline-wise, we're going to get the BPM change before the effective date. So We're just waiting for the Tariff language to come in. So it's probably in the coming, 2 months, I would say. In the next 1 month or two, we'll have the BPM language out and ready.
Okay. Thank you, Abdul. So we have one more question on the phone queue is what I'm seeing. So let's take that question now before we get into our stakeholder comments and responses to those.
Sure. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, everyone. This is Mike Whitney with NCPA. So it sounds like there's no real need for us to pressure our plants to provide planned outage schedules in the long-term time frame because, we kind of hassle them to get us the numbers or the hours and the plans by October 15th to get into long-term to see if we can get in the queue early enough to avoid the postal assignment. But now it sounds like there's no need for that. We can just wait right until after, anywhere in the planned time frame up until like T-8. Is that understanding correct?
Abdul, would you like to handle that one? I'm not going to venture into the incentives or the timing of when planned outages come in.
Yeah, sure. So the outage coordination process still exists. We're not changing that. So these rules are only affecting the RA side of things and the substitution obligations. And from an RA point of view, strictly RA point of view, yes. I mean, if it's planned, it's planned, and it has the same obligation. But from an outage coordination process, the earlier you submit your outage, the higher priority you get in approval. So, I think the October 15th timeline is to get on the study for next year, and for the long range, we have dates, 120 days in advance, mid range, 45 days in advance. So those dates in our BPM's procedures for outage coordination are still applicable. And the sooner you submit your outages, the sooner we can study it, we can give you approval ahead of time, and you get priority. So if another outage comes in later and it conflicts with yours, and we have to pick one of the two, we're going to pick the one that made it to the earlier submission window. So a long-range outage would get higher priority than a mid-range outage. And, same thing with the short range, you would get even a lower priority. So there's always that incentive to get there as soon as possible. So definitely we're still encouraging people to submit outages as soon as possible. That's not changing in this process.
But you've been saying that the only reason you guys reject the outages is because the substitution isn't there. So it sounds like we can just take our time. So that's good to know. Thank you.
Well, not really. I mean, we could reject the outage for any reliability reason other than, outage studies and coordination is not just RA. RA is one aspect of it. If there's we study outages. We do reliability studies using many tools. Sierra doesn't do studies. Sierra just does accounting rules for outages and RA and capacity being missing and substitution needed. There's engineers that do studies offline, outage coordinators that coordinate outages. That whole process still happens, and we study those for reliability, and there's always an incentive and advantage for people who submit outages earlier than others.
Yeah. So again, I just to bring to a close what Abdul said is this is an element for resource adequacy, not the limit of planned outages as a whole. There are still benefits to doing so. If you choose to wait to report the planned outage, or we're doing it today simply for POSO reasons, as Abdul has clarified, there's still other reasons to get that in early. Remember, we are still doing all of our reliability assessments of the system to make sure that ultimately, even if substitution is there, that the outage can be taken and done so reliably. This is just kind of a first hurdle on this one. Let's see, I think we had another question come in on the phone line, or on the chat line here. I'm trying to make sure we got these. One moment. Just came in the phone. Okay, so summer months unchanged for 2021, June to September. I always get this one mixed up. I think that's right, Grant, that it's going to be June to September. But again, it's not really the question of when the summer ends in this context is not really relevant. It's really that the starting is going to be for summer of 2021. The requirements are going to roll straight through even the off-peak months because, again, RA is scaled to the forecasted load, so making sure we've got the capacity, the RA capacity available to demonstrate that the requirements that are set are meaningful and being met. Those exist all year round. Another question, can you confirm that SCs will have the functionality in SEER to change the specified substitution resource ID? I think this is an implementation question that I'm going to Abdul, if you can answer it quickly, I'm happy to let you, but otherwise I think we've got processes once we move through this to make sure that all the functionality is provided to the market participants to provide all the information necessary to make the substitute capacity available. All right. So
yeah, really quick, it's the same process we have today. They have to provide specific resource ID for substitution. That substitution process is not changing.
Okay. All right, we've got two more questions on the phone, and then hopefully we'll be able to move on to address some of the specific stakeholder comments and questions that were submitted.
Moving on to the first caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Carl. This is Noah from SDG. So what I'm gathering is that this proposal is more geared towards longer-term planned outages. So let me walk through. If I put in, or if SDG puts in an outage of T-minus 120 days, the substitution won't be required until T-minus 44. Can you confirm that?
That's correct.
Okay. And then, so after T-minus the 45 period, what does the ISO propose to do for new planned outages after T45? Is it only a 24-hour sort of time frame for substitution?
Abdul, did we go with the had to come in at the exact same time as the request, or that they had 24 hours for those as well? I don't remember the specifics, but basically it was if we know your RA, the requirement holds, and you have to provide that substitute capacity at the time of the request. I think we do provide a little bit of a wiggle room on that, but Abdul, I'll defer to you on that one.
Yes, Carl. So any outage that comes in after T-minus 45, they'll get 24 hours from the next validation run. So we're going to run the validation once a day at a set hour, and when the validation runs, it will pick up all the outages up to date and assign their substitution. So it's the 24-hour clock as we're planning to implement it as of now. It's start ticking not from the submission of the outage, it's from the next validation run. So it could be 24 hours. It could be a little bit more, up to 47 hours and 59 minutes, depends on when you submit the outage. But it's 24 hours after we display the CR substitution requirements. You have 24 hours to provide substitution. And by the way, we had the CPG yesterday where we discussed a lot of those implementation details. Maybe we have a recording posted as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Abdul. Yesterday you and I had, as well as David, had this discussion, and I was told that this is a policy question, so I should bring it up here. So, have you guys given additional thoughts to how this 24 to 48 hour requirement really sort of potentially makes substitution procurement somewhat impossible? At times, if I have a planned outage that I know is coming down in, let's say, 10 days, it's in the ISO software for new planned outages after T45, it's still considered a planned outage, but maybe I don't have the substitute capacity yet, but I'm in the process of procuring. But because of the bilateral contracting nature, of the RA program in California, what if I'm unable to procure it within the 24-hour window? Can you talk a bit more about maybe you guys could think about a different time scale for after T45 planned outages?
Okay, yeah, so we have thought about this, Noah, and I'm probably going to misstate something here, but I've got David and Abdul to correct me if I do. In that instance, the goal is to report the planned outage as soon as possible, and it's planned when the substitution is made available to take that outage. So again, I think that's an instance where if you know the planned outage is coming in 10 days and it's not movable, you can submit a forced outage for that, assuming it's one of the unique instances where the resources is in imminent danger of breaking down. And if you're able to procure that substitute capacity in the next couple of days, i.e. before T-8, you could cancel the forced outage, resubmit a planned outage request as long as it comes in prior to that T-8 day deadline. So again, still trying to get that outage reported and provide options to getting the substitute capacity to the ISO. David, Abdul, did I misstate anything on that front?
No, I think that's basically kind of what we thought it through. Yeah, so if you're in that circumstance and you know at the T-10 window you can't get substitute capacity arranged, you could wait until the T-8, put it as a forced outage, assuming that, there's a good faith belief that the plant is at sort of its breaking point. And then we plan for the outage to happen at that 8-day time frame. Right. And then if you're able to get substitute capacity, then you could cancel the force, submit a new planned outage for, as long as you're going to plan to take it more than the 8 days out. And that's how you would sort of navigate that scenario.
I'm really confused. So you're telling SCs to submit into the Kaiso OMS for a forced outage at T-10?
No.
Okay. So it's a planned outage at T-10.
That's right.
Okay. So because it's a planned outage, but I don't have the substitute capacity yet, if I know that it will be denied the next day, if you will, and but I am in compliance with the ISO's tariff that says, when you know about an outage, tell us and put it into OMS, and I have done that. But then once it's denied,
I think you're turned around on something there. You're not.
Okay.
Yeah, I think in this case you would wait, even though you're at T-10, do nothing, wait till T-8, and then put in the forced outage. We need to double check this, but the idea of being obligated to report as soon as you know is, I think, limited to forced outages. So for planned outages, you don't need to report it as soon as you know about it.
Subject to the benefits that Abdul has already laid out.
Yeah, like we want to have an incentive structure for you to report as early as you can. But we were scratching our heads trying to see, is there something in the tariff that says if you know you're going to take a planned outage in 35 days and you wait until the 32nd day to report it to the ISO, is that any sort of violation? And we're thinking, well, no, that's not that we were aware of. And I think if there is anything in the tariff that someone has stumbled across that would suggest it is, please point that out, and we could conceivably look at clarifying that language through this filing, because I think the way we're putting all the pieces together, we weren't thinking there's necessarily a need to have such a rule in place, which, again, I don't think there is, but if there's something in the tariff someone came across that suggested there is, please point it out and we'll take a look.
Gotcha. I appreciate that clarification. Yeah, if you guys could provide that into, maybe the FERC filing and with sort of descriptive words of, you're telling SCs to sort of withhold the outage submission for planned outages and after the T45 time window until they have the substitute capacity such that they can meet the 24-hour period requirement. That would be fantastic. And then if they don't have it, then they should just wait until it's essentially a forced outage. But then I would really question sort of, at which point if you then, at a later point, you find substitute capacity, I don't exactly understand why you would cancel the forced outage and then resubmit a planned outage within the forced outage time window because now you have substitute capacity. Wouldn't it just be a forced outage substitution altogether,
No, I don't think we're telling SCs what to do and not to do in deciding when to submit the outages. I think what we're saying is if you submit a planned outage, you got to submit substitution. If you don't, we're going to deny it. If you want to wait till you have the substitution ready, submit the planned outage. That seems to be in alignment with the rules. But it's really ultimately your decision how you want to provide your outages and submit them. I think the key thing is
Noah?
We're talking about planned outage, so it's not like you learned about a planned outage. You're planning to do an outage, and part of the planning, you're picking the dates, you're picking, getting the crews, getting the budget. There's a lot of work gets done in the planning of a planned outage. So you could add to that, finding substitution. So it's not really finding out. You're working and planning and trying to find the date and for the outage. So I think maybe that's a little bit confusing on what do you mean by you figured out that or you learned that you need to submit an outage. Versus for a forced outage, you learn that the unit broke and shut down, or the unit is in imminent danger of breaking because something else broke or deteriorated and the unit needs to be taken out now or really soon. That's a forced outage, and that's something you learn about. So I hope that you get the difference between the two.
Yeah, let me, if I may respond to that. I think, sort of one of the scenarios I'm thinking about is maybe it's a tube leak, right? It doesn't, the plant does not need to shut down immediately. It can wait a little bit longer, but we are aware of a tube leak, and we can try to, get substitute capacity for that. But we are trying to meet the requirements to make sure, sort of under our current interpretation or understanding of the Kaiso tariff is that notify the Kaiso, hey, in 10 days we can limp along. It's not going to be called a forced outage because after the T45 window, we are going to give you 10 days of notice, and we would like to take this outage because it's planned. That's under the classification of the Kaiso's tariff, right? Does that make sense?
No, I think the key, there's one key, something to think about here is we're not changing any of these rules with this policy initiative. So today, if you submit a planned outage and you don't provide substitution, we're going to deny it. Maybe we're going to deny it a little bit later, but eventually we're going to deny the outage. With this policy, we're just going to deny it right away if you don't provide a substitution. There were benefits to doing that to stakeholders and to the Kaiso. So I think we're getting into details that perhaps if you're not clear on, then there are issues for you today that you have to get clarity on, and maybe we can discuss that offline. But I don't think they're related to this policy specifically.
Yeah, and if I'm not making it clear for you guys to understand. I apologize. Maybe other market participants and stakeholders can help and chime in on clarifying the situations in which the ISO is provided here. Essentially, what I heard David say was, after T45, if you have a plan, if you're going to plan for a planned outage, don't submit it until you have the substitute capacity. Otherwise, you're going to get denied. Period. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody. So I want to clarify a couple questions that we've gotten in the chat box, and then I want to do a quick time check because I want to make sure we've got the operationalizing storage piece still to come, and that we know is going to be there are some significant changes in there. So I want to make sure Gabe has ample time to go through those. But one of the questions that came up to the panelists was, when would tariff language be released? We're hoping to get that out by the end of the week, probably early next week. Just to make sure stakeholders are aware of that. So I'm going to ask if the two final operator, we still have two questions on the phone queue. If we can make those quick, I'll take those, and then we'll move on.
Sure. So actually, there is only one question in the queue right now. Looks like the other caller dropped, doesn't have a question. So, caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Carl. It's Bonnie Blair for the Six Cities Group.
Hey, Bonnie.
How does this apply, if at all, to import RA resources?
So an import resource, if it's a non-resource specific.
Let's say it's resource specific.
Well, they're still going to, if they're still reporting an outage, they're still going to have replacement obligations.
Okay. Now, so the timeline's the same, the submission's the same, and the substitution obligation is there. What about MIC? So if you're providing substitute capacity for an import RA resource, can you use the MIC allowance for the resource that's on outage to import the substitute?
I'm going to have to defer to my colleagues on whether or not we allow, because I always get this one mixed up too, if we allow imports to provide planned outage substitution or not. I apologize for not knowing this one offhand.
It depends on, Carl, so it depends on the type of the import and if they have a planned outage reporting requirement. So if they submit a planned outage, then yes, they the same rules apply to them and the substitution rules. And in this case, to the MIC question, the MIC is tied to the scheduling coordinator. So if the outage, if the resource on outage is the same as the resource that is being used for substitution, not the same, sorry, it has the same scheduling coordinator and is coming from the same tie, then that scheduling coordinator can use that MIC capability, but because they have that MIC capability. So the MIC the substitution requires MIC capability of the SC on that scheduling point or branch group that the substitute capacity is coming from. So if the SC providing substitution has that capability, then they can use an import for substitution. And this is only for forced outages, by the way. The planned outages have to substitute internal resources, even for imports. But if it's a forced outage, they can use an import for substitute for an import, and they need a MIC capability. And if they don't, they can trade. Someone can give them their capability. So trading can happen, from one SC to another to give them the capability on the branch group they want MIC. They need a MIC to bring that substitute capacity from.
So I think you sort of threw something in the middle that to me is a big qualification, and that was, this whole discussion has been about planned outages, right? So if there's a planned outage of a resource-specific import resource, why should you not be able to provide substitute capacity from another import resource if there's MIC available?
So these are, just to clarify, everything I just said are existing goals, and none of these are changing with this policy initiative. So to answer the question, this wasn't part of the policy that came in 6 or 7 years ago and with RSI, and I don't know what the reasoning was. I don't know if Carl remembers what was the reasoning for this, but these are all existing goals, everything I said, and they're not changing with this policy initiative.
Well, but you're making a big change in requiring substitution for all planned outages. So I mean, it seems as though this ought to be on the table. If you're imposing a substitute obligation, why not increase the pool that can provide substitute capacity if it's feasible to do that?
Again, Bonnie, is this for the forced outages you're talking about?
No, I'm talking about planned outages.
Can you submit that in comments, Bonnie? We'll try and offer a response to that and work with you offline on that.
Okay. Sure, I'll do that.
All right, appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, so I do want to move on because, again, we're only now getting into, I think, the contentious stuff where people, stakeholders, put in their thoughts about why they did not like our proposal. And we recognize that there are different philosophical views that we are taking relative to a lot of our stakeholders, and so we got a fair amount of pushback on our proposal. We did get support. Not everybody disliked it, so we get support from a couple stakeholders, including CPUC staff, Wellhead, and LS Power, supporting the two-phase approach, kind of looking at this as kind of an understanding is this is maybe not the most well-liked but potentially necessary first step. I think CalCCA was not wholly unsupportive, but they were really more focused on the second phase and really getting into that one. But again, stakeholder objections to the ISO's proposal fell into, I think, 4 basic subheadings, and we're going to address each one of these individually. So the first one is there's sufficient excess non-RA capacity and substitution is not needed. This is kind of I shouldn't have to provide substitute capacity because really I'm taking a planned outage. There's a bunch of stuff out there and it's March. The second is kind of the flip side of that is, well, there's no substitute capacity available. The third one was again, we talked about some of this with our principles, was requiring planned outage substitution incentivizes capacity withholding, which basically there's a liquidity argument of the more substitute capacity you require, the more some LSEs or SCs are going to hold on to the capacity to provide that substitution kind of on a just-in-case basis. And then finally, the proposal will not incrementally improve reliability. So our goal on this is again, these are I think there are kind of some spin-off or slight variants on these arguments. We tried to consolidate things down into what we felt were kind of the most discussed elements of disagreement with the ISO's proposal. If we can go to the next slide, we'll go through each of these. Well, let me rephrase that. I'll go through all of the objections, and then we'll stop for questions because, again, we want to be cognizant of the time. So, again, the presence of non-RA or the lack of substitute capacity should not relieve an RA resource of its obligation to be available to the ISO. So, again, when we look at resource adequacy at kind of a principled level, you have sold a product and service, which is to say I am going to be available to the ISO's market. That's what I'm being paid for. you can't do that, then, you know, what's the ramifications of that? Well, our proposal simply says that if you can't do that, you find somebody that can. And so that what we have, even in some of those off-peak months where there's a lot of capacity available maybe on the system, we still have RA obligations, and we still have challenging conditions during some of those off-peak months. Sometimes, you know, in October or May, we have hot days, and we just need to be prepared for that. And additionally, what it does, it avoids leaning on and or over-reliance on non-RA capacity, which can lead to the potential for CPM designations. Again, RA is there as the front stop. Having that capacity available to us ensures that we're not basically leaning on free capacity, that we have, if that capacity is there and available to us, you know, in excess of RA, that's great, but that shouldn't mean that we are able to just lean on them without compensating them for providing service when a resource on planned outage couldn't. Again, one of the other things we like to note is that the planning reserve margin that we have at in basically any of the LRAs in our BAA, the planning reserve margin doesn't account for planned outages, because again, the idea is you're working with the ISO to schedule those in such a way that we can maintain reliability and or providing substitute capacity to ensure that we have adequate resource adequacy capacity. So taking a planned outage should degrade our planning reserve margin. That should happen for the forced outages that we have today or for forecast error or for our reserve needs, not for planned outages. And again, when we look at other ISOs that allow resources to take planned outages without substitution, they do so because there is excess RA capacity relative to forecasted needs. Not just excess market energy, but these are ISOs or RTOs that have either annual or seasonal RA requirements where they can say, okay, because we procured to a high level, you can take a planned outage in May because our peak is in July, and we have excess capacity such that if you take it, our forecasts are still below what our available RA capacity is. So again, we don't think what we're proposing here is that far or that out of line or that unreasonable. We think it's basically a very principled position, which is to say you've provided RA to the ISO, there's an obligation to be available, and it's consistent with what other ISOs do. Moving on. Okay. So again, providing RA is a commitment to be available to the ISO. I know you heard this on the last slide, but it bears repeating. So if an RA resource is unable to provide RA, it should have an obligation to find another resource that is available or not be shown for RA that month, or face the financial and regulatory consequences of not being available. That means, you know, maybe the outage comes in as planned, but there are implications that you didn't find the planned outage, you didn't find the substitution. Then what happens? We get into all the fun stuff of, is it planned to force? Is it a tariff violation? Those are all fun and interesting questions, which is to say, as Abdul noted earlier, we're not changing any of the ISO's policies on those. We have tried to clarify some of that a bit. But again, there's implications. You've sold RA. You don't just get the money. You don't get to take the money and run, basically. If another resource is available when an RA resource wants to take that planned outage, then the RA resource should, then the resource that is available, that's the one that should be RA, not the one trying to take the planned outage. Or at a minimum, that resource should be compensated by the RA resource for stepping in to provide the service that the RA resource could not because of the planned outage. Again, substitute capacity it should be abundant in off-peak months and relatively inexpensive. So simply saying, I shouldn't need to because there's a lot of it out there, well, there's a lot of it out there, it should be easy. And again, the RA obligations and requirements are there. They're there for a reason. They're there for planning purposes. And, you know, I think there are challenges that some don't look at, you know, a March RA obligation is all that important. These are requirements. And so if you can't fulfill it, you should be able to find substitute capacity. Now, the lack of available substitute capacity indicates one of two things. As Abdul noted earlier, maybe you just waited too long to come in to request your planned outage, and others scooped up that planned outage, that substitute capacity, or the forecasted load conditions dictate that the resource is just needed, and now is a bad time to try and take a planned outage. I would note that other ISOs back in the East, they actually do not allow for planned outages during their peak months. They require that all the planned outages be taken in the off-peak months. I believe it was PJM, and somebody's going to call me out on this if I'm wrong, I'm sure, does not allow RA resources to take planned outages between the months of, I think, May through August. So again, what we're requiring is in line with what is happening elsewhere, which is to say, if there's not available capacity relative to the forecasted needs, you don't take the outage because you're needed. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So we understand that the POSO obligations that we put out here are a bit more onerous than what they've been in the past. Basically, resource SDs could come in, put their planned outages in, and kind of roll the dice at T-20 to see whether or not we'd come back and say they had to provide substitute capacity. Well, we've clarified that, if we were running it now at T-20, the answer would be yes. And so this is going to create a bit of incremental incentives relative to what exists today to hold capacity out of the bilateral marketplace to mitigate potential penalties for denied planned outages. We understand this. However, ultimately, when balancing this risk with the idea of having that adequate capacity available relative to the RA requirements and ensuring that our planning reserve margin is not degraded for planned outages, we lean in the favor of ensuring that our our planning reserve margin is not degraded. So again, our ultimate policy goal is to eliminate these types of bad incentives. We think proposals like UCAP will help do that. Because again, and the planned outage replacement pool, because they take that incentive away. Those planned outage and forced outage incentives are now basically lifted. They're handled ahead of time, and we're not trying to deal with avoiding penalties in real time. So the incentives for some of those bad incentives to hold that capacity out go away. And again, while we acknowledge that there is an incremental risk of this policy, it is temporary, and we expect that within by 2023, our goal is to have our year 2023, that we would have the long-term solution developed and implemented. Whew. A lot of stuff going on here. Let's move on to the next slide. So arguments that the ISO's proposal will not provide incremental reliability for the summer 2021, we disagree with this. And again, part of this goes to the idea of planned outages potentially degrading and cutting into planning reserve margins when some of those outages are coming in such time where they're well in advance of when we could even reasonably forecast what loads are going to be. If somebody had asked us last year, what's your weather going to look like on August 15th, we probably wouldn't have approved incremental planned outages. I mean, we struggled with some of the ones that were being extended, but, we don't know this far in advance what our load conditions are going to be. So what we've done with our proposal is we've provided that clarity. We've tried to provide a better window for resource SCs to say, when can I get substitute capacity such that the ISO's planning reserve margin is not degraded and we can keep up with reliability. The argument that it will lead them to defer planned outages, I'm not sure how much that's going to push off a planned outage to provide substitute capacity at some point in time. The time intervals where we're seeing most of the planned outages occur, which is the off-peak months, substitute capacity should be available, and those planned outages should be happening well in advance of our summer peaks. Let's move on to slide 16. And I do apologize. I know I'm covering a ton of ground here, and we'll stop for questions in a minute. I just, again, want to make sure that we're moving forward so Gabe has ample time. At this time, we propose to treat all planned outage extensions as new outage requests. So, well, actually, no, before I get into, no, I'm going to wrap these up because these are going to be quick, and then we'll move back to questions. So we are going to propose to treat all planned outage extensions as new outage requests. This helps in a couple different ways. It is consistent with the ISO's proposal to basically ensure that we're requiring substitution so that they come in. It's not a situation where it's like, well, I'm already on outage, so what are you going to say? Well, we're going to say give us substitute capacity or be subject to RAIM, and it provides, we think, just a little bit of clarity, even if it's not what we would say a substantive difference from current practices. It does provide clarity. It also provides us with data clarity as we look forward and try and go about tracking all of the planned versus forced outages and reporting through OMS as we move into calculating the UCAP values. This provides a lot cleaner data set just because we have each of the outages is now kind of separated out. We don't have some of the overrun and data questions. Okay, and it ensures that the ISO has adequate capacity to maintain reliability when resources don't return to service. It also provides incentives potentially or most likely for the resource to try and stay on track to keep the ISO updated on the status of the outage and get back online, in a timely manner. So finally, I think the phase 2 of this, and I'm not going to get into this too much, we're going to look on building the long-term proposal on this in our phase 2 element on this, basically working on the planned outage replacement pool so that we have substitute capacity available ahead of time so that we are not worried about planned outages. We can just work with the pool we have to best accommodate those. So I want to recognize that we are over time by, I think, not a little bit, by quite a bit. I want to take a couple minutes for questions simply because, well, we should, but I want to recognize that we'll probably only be able to get to 1 or 2 of them. And I would encourage people to put their questions into the chat box. And one of the other things I also recommend, because I think a lot of people are doing this, is their questions are being channeled to the panelists only. So if you could check the 2 to all attendees so that everybody can see your questions, I think that would be helpful. For planned intertie outages, the one question we do have online.
Actually, Carl, I just wanted to let you know that the attendees can chat only to the panelists.
Only to the panelists.
The option of them chatting to all attendees is disabled.
Okay, we'll have to work on that because I think it's what I've heard is they only see the responses that I offered all attendees, and it's a little confusing. But we'll work on that for future calls. That's okay. Thank you for that information.
No problem. Thank you.
No, that's all right. So for planned intertie outages, RA imports are not required to provide substitute RA capacity. Again, this is one of the exemptions that we have made in the paper, that they would not have that obligation because when we approve the planned outage on that intertie or that transmission line, I want to make sure I don't misstate something on about the ties, but that we've done so knowing that there's RA capacity backing that up, and so that resource would not have a POSO obligation. So I think I've answered the questions in the chat. We have time, I'm going to say, for 1 question online. Okay, please indicate who wrote the question. All right, we will do so in the future, Chris. Chris has asked me to let people know who are writing the questions. It's kind of the way to clarify things. Why don't we just, I will be paying attention to the chat box from here on out. I'm going to turn it over to Gabe for the operationalizing storage. And if you have questions or concerns that I have not already addressed in our responses to the stakeholder comments, feel free to put them in there, and I will do my best to address each of them in turn. So with that, thank you very much. one question on the phone as of now. I got to turn it over to Gabe. I already committed. I apologize. Like I said, happy to answer those questions in the chat box as we go.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Gabe Berthoff from California ISO. We'll be talking about operationalizing storage in this section. Thank you for the slide. This has been a bit of an interesting part of the policy. We've been discussing it, not necessarily the merits of the policy, but the fact that we're doing the policy in this initiative and we've been discussing it in the summer 2021 preparedness initiative. So I think many of the stakeholders on this call have already had the sneak preview that we've sort of rolled out or said that we're going to roll out in that initiative. So with that said, I do have sort of a few slides of introduction here, which are largely the same, outlining sort of the problem that we're trying to solve with this minimum stated charge requirement. And then I have a couple slides outlining a lot of the changes, which Carl's already alluded to, that we're trying to make. Also, just in light of the time right now, I think we were initially scheduled to finish this section at 3:20. I will make all efforts to finish up by 3:30 so that we can move on to our final topic for today. So yeah, this first slide is largely a recap of what we've talked about previously. The CPUC has authorized over the next 3 years, this year inclusive, 3,300 megawatts of new resource adequacy procurement for capacity in that time. The ISO expects about 1,800 megawatts of resource adequacy capacity online on August 1st. And that would be 1,800 megawatts of storage capacity online by August 1st. Some of that storage is standalone storage. Much of that storage is located at existing solar or wind facilities and would be modeled as a co-located resource or a hybrid resource. And today we only have about 550 megawatts of dispatchable storage online. And obviously that's going to be quite a big difference between, what we have online today and how we manage that and getting to that 1,800 megawatts, most of which has a COD date of August 1st. So we'll see a lot of capacity added just in that first day of August or around that time. Just on the horizon here, when we're thinking about periods after this next 3 years, we do have the retirement of Diablo Canyon, the large nuclear facility, in 2024. I believe the CPUC just put out some additional calls for procurement in the IRP process, and there will be quite a bit of new capacity added to the system for that. The ISO expects, and I think this was also discussed in the IRP, that much of that new capacity will be storage, and the ISO will continue to need to develop tools to manage storage resources and the co-located and hybrid resources as we see more and more of that capacity come online from the relatively small amount that we have today. These resources are presenting new integration challenges, and one of the tools that we presented, particularly here in this stakeholder initiative, has been the minimum stated charge requirements. And the idea there is that this tool would work with other resource adequacy tools to ensure that the ISO has enough capacity online in the real-time market to be able to operate the grid reliably. So if we go on to the next slide, this is a graph that I've shown a few times. It shows on the teal line the total demand on the system, that's that upper line, and it shows a purple line below the teal line, and that's the net demand. Net demand on the system is just demand minus wind and solar generation. So you can see a little bit of a gap in between the two lines in the morning and in the evening. That gap generally represents wind generation on our system. And then there's a very large gap between the two lines in the middle part of the day, and that's generally when solar is online and available. This, of course, is a moderately temperatured spring day, so March 17th, 2020, so about a year ago from today. and you can see that the lowest net loads are indeed that middle part of the day when there's a lot of solar on the system, and the highest net loads are during the morning hours when people are just waking up and turning on appliances in their houses, and then the evening hours generally when people come home from work and the sun is setting, so you no longer have solar generation. Prices in the ISO markets are highly correlated with the net loads, so that purple line. So when the line is lowest during those middle hours of the day, that generally corresponds to the lowest prices in the market. And when the purple line is highest, that also generally corresponds to the highest price periods of the day. So in this particular day, we can see that prices are pretty low when the sun's up, when solar is being generated, and then prices are highest during the morning peak and the evening peak after the solar's already set for the day, or the sun hasn't come up yet in the morning. So ideally, if I was a storage resource and I wanted to take advantage of this, I would want to charge during those low price periods and discharge during the high price periods. Luckily, our day ahead market, when it considers when to schedule resources for energy, it recognizes that over this 24-hour period, there's opportunities for storage resources to arbitrage and potentially earn incremental revenues. During the periods when they're producing or providing energy, they're offsetting more expensive gas generation that would otherwise be producing in the system. During those low price periods of the day when they're absorbing additional energy, they are requiring additional energy to be generated by the ISO, but generally it's the lowest marginal cost gas generation, or it could even be renewable generation that they're using to charge those resources with. That's a typical spring day. On the next slide, I show a very high load and net load summer day. This, in fact, was August 16th, 2020. This particular day had loads in excess, as you can see on this graph, of 42,000 megawatts. It had net loads in excess of about 40,000 megawatts. So there are periods when this load goes up above 40,000. You can see the same sort of pattern, though. Generally, the purple line is very close to the teal line in the morning hours and in the evening hours, and that gap represents the wind generation. And then during the middle part of the day, say from hour ending 8 to hour ending, 18 maybe, you've got a significant amount of solar generation causing a pretty wide gap between the demand and the net demand. In this same period, we would also expect that storage resources would be scheduled to charge during the lowest price hours of the day, so hour ending 9, 10, 11, and then they would be scheduled to discharge in hours ending 19, 20, 21 when prices are highest. This particular day is interesting. I've also drawn some additional boxes on here to sort of outline some of the problems that we anticipate in the future as we see more storage joining the grid. So if, for example, we have retirement of 24/7 gas generation, which I don't think, which is expected from where we're at right now. Specifically, in the next few years, we'd likely see the retirement of the OTC gas steam resources. And typically what we're seeing is those resources are being replaced with storage resources. So 4-hour duration storage might be represented here by this red box, and then typical traditional 24/7 generation might be represented by this blue box. Well, if I only have, in this graph maybe 35,000 megawatts of 24/7 generation, it's absolutely going to be necessary that I have a few thousand megawatts of storage generation. And on this particular day, it's not only critical that I have that few thousand megawatts of storage generation, but it's also critical that we get those few thousand megawatts of storage generation charged sufficiently so that when we get to the point where we can't rely on 24/7 generation anymore, which is about 1730 or so, then we have that state of charge and we're able to use it to dispatch over the net load peak in the evening. So the idea here on the next slide is that, like I said, our day-ahead market solves this problem very well. So we get a solution in the day-ahead market, and that day-ahead market storage resources and other resource adequacy resources have a 24/7 must-offer obligation. So we have all the capacity available to the ISO in the day-ahead market. We also have market power mitigation. So even during these hours when storage is marginal, they don't have the ability to exercise market power. So we get an efficient solution from our day-ahead market. And then in the real-time market, we can use the must-offer obligation at the day-ahead schedule. So this is the same must-offer obligation we're proposing for non-storage resources as well as storage resources to be available in the real-time market. And then we also impose this charge requirement at the day-ahead schedule, which is the tool that we're proposing here, the minimum stated charge requirement. And then we're also imposing market power mitigation on storage resources in the real-time market, again, so they can't exercise market power during those critical hours when they might be essential to operating the grid. Okay, let me see here. Yeah, I do have a question, a few questions. We've all heard about storage resources. So Mike Castellano asks, we have also heard that storage resources have been issued EDs to charge and then no ED to discharge. This can be problematic. Can the Kaiso commit to exploring this in early stages of the upcoming storage initiative? Yeah, Mike, I think we can do that. Just the spoiler alert here is that there's a number of questions here. So let me try to address those. I think we are planning to start a new storage initiative. It's going to be called the Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative. We should be starting that in March or April, that time frame, and we'll have an issue paper for that. We are going to be developing a replacement tool to the minimum stated charge requirements and I'll get into this in the next slide. We're only asking for 2 years worth of authority for this particular tool. So I do think we can commit to exploring exceptional dispatches for storage resources. Also, one of the topics that we're planning to address specifically is to develop an exceptional dispatch tool for storage, which would specifically target stated charge values for those resources. And I think those values would then have compensation associated with them and could include opportunity costs for those resources. So let me scroll up here. I've got a lot of chat here that I see. Okay. So Mike Castellano also asked, I think Kaiso has done a lot to make this seem more like an emergency tool than it was originally designed to be, which is good. It also sounds like the MSOC will end up being the tool that operators can use for EDing energy storage resources. Is it accurate? Yeah. So, like I said, I think in the time for the time being, operators could potentially use sort of the back-end functionality of the minimum stated charge requirement tool to effectively dispatch a resource. But like I said, we will be taking this up in Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative and talking about it more there. Paul Nelson asked, the DMM report noted that batteries were charging during August 14th, stage 3, because the prices indicated that they were economic. The question that I was not able to make yesterday is, will this proposal provide any protection to prevent batteries from charging during emergencies? Why isn't the Kaiso for summer 2021 considering a special rule that would apply only during emergencies that would prevent charging? I think you've hit on something here, Paul. Yeah, when we're in stage 3 emergencies, I think some of the pricing scenarios that we have don't always make the most sense. If we're calling on demand response programs, what should prices really be? And I know that was one of the questions that we talked about in the summer preparedness meeting yesterday. I would continue to advocate and say that, you're right. Storage resources are dispatched like other resources based on their bids in the market and the prevailing local market prices at their location. And if those prices aren't very high, then those storage resources could potentially get dispatched to charge, and I think that's what you're referring to on August 14th. I do think it's an interesting question and likely one where we need to address some of the pricing issues or some of the pricing just in general of when the ISO is in an emergency, like a stage 3 emergency or something like that. Yeah, so Mike Castellano also asked about bid cost recovery, and he asked correctly if that would be covered in the Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative, which is the upcoming initiative. Mike, that's absolutely correct. We will be addressing that question there as well, and I think it's very relevant and timely. Yeah, okay. I think we've addressed, let me just see. Sorry, I'm having trouble scrolling here. Yes, Alva, you've asked here, how will regulation be accounted for in the minimum stated charge constraint logic? We are still discussing specifically how this is going to be implemented with other resource within the storage resources, but my understanding is that the minimum stated charge should also account for regulation. So essentially, if I'm requiring that a storage resource have a certain amount of stated charge, and let's just say that's full stated charge, I believe that that's going to preclude the resource from having a regulation award, which would also require some additional stated charge. So essentially, your stated charge could potentially be used for minimum stated charge requirements, or it could potentially be used for regulation or something like that. It can't be used for both. There's no double counting there. So Alva also asked another question. If a battery does not deviate from its day-ahead schedule but does not respect the minimum stated charge constraint based on Kaiso telemetry, are there any imbalance charges incurred? So I don't believe so. If you're sticking to your day-ahead schedule, you would never be in violation of the minimum stated charge requirement. So I don't think you'd have any issues there. I'm a little bit, I know there have been some telemetry questions that have come up about actual storage resources and their operations. So I think it would be important to continue to track those. So we'll continue working with stakeholders that are having issues with telemetry, but I think that's a good question. Yeah, so Alva also asked, and these are great questions, by the way, and I apologize for sort of going in rapid fire, and then I'll get back to sort of, as soon as I'm done with these questions, I will revert back to the slide deck and finish up the last two slides. But Alva also asked, will batteries be aware of the minimum stated charge constraint on their own batteries on the operating date? The answer to that is yes. Again, we're still trying to work out the details on how the storage resources are going to get that information, but the idea would be that we would run the RUC process. After the RUC process is run, then we would know what, first of all, we would know if the minimum stated charge requirement is going to be imposed, and if it is imposed, then we would be able to sort of vocalize what those requirements are to scheduling coordinators so that they're aware of those requirements for the next day. I'm getting quite a bit of chat here, so I'm going to take a quick pause from the chat, and then I'm going to come back. Susan, I know you have a question in the chat, so I will answer that as soon as I'm done with the last two slides here. So if we could advance the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So, like I've mentioned here, and I think we've sort of gotten into some of the meat of the proposal. We did have quite a bit of stakeholder feedback. We also had a number of opportunities to interact with stakeholders and sort of get feedback from stakeholders through the Summer 2021 Preparedness Initiative. So we've been doing quite a bit of work there, and we've had some offline conversations with market participants as well. And I think the ISO has really come a long way to trying to address some of those concerns that we heard from the stakeholder community. Here's how we're envisioning this working today. So first, the minimum stated charge requirement will continue to ensure that RA resources can meet discharge schedules awarded in the day-ahead market. So like I was saying, after we run the day-ahead market, we'll get a schedule for storage resources. That schedule will then be used to determine what the minimum stated charge requirements will actually be, and we will only be imposing this requirement on resource adequacy resources. And that's something that's been a part of this policy for a while. Second, the ISO software will only be applying the minimum stated charge on days when system conditions are very tight. So we only plan to impose the minimum stated charge requirement on days when we have a ruck in feasibility. So essentially a period when supply cannot equal demand or does not equal demand for one of the hours that's solved in the ruck market after the day-ahead market runs. And if there is a ruck in feasibility in the market, those are the days when we would plan to trigger or use the minimum stated charge requirements. We anticipate that this would be used very infrequently. For example, we had ruck and feasibilities during 23 days over the summer of 2020. Most of these days were in August, September, and October. 23 days may seem like a lot, but also remember that 2020 was an extremely high heat year. So there were many days when the system was extremely taxed in that year. By contrast, 2019 and 2018, when temperatures were milder, there was only one ruck in feasibility in each of those years. So maybe on a more typical year, we might only use the minimum stated charge requirement on a handful of days. If things are really bad next year, like they were in 2020, this year, we might see this triggered in the ballpark of something like 20 days. But we're really not planning to see the minimum stated charge requirements imposed on a ton of days. And then I'd also like to add to that the ISO operations team would have the ability to cancel or initiate the minimum stated charge requirement in the real-time market. I think we've built in a window, I believe, from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m., where operators will have an opportunity to review real-time information. If that real-time information sort of turns out that we had a ruck in feasibility the day before, but suddenly, maybe all these resources, when they knew that the market was sort of having difficulties, came back from outage unexpectedly. Maybe some of the grid conditions, maybe if there was a wildfire, it's sort of been mitigated or contained, and things are looking much better in the real-time market. They do have the ability to cancel the minimum stated charge requirement, but they also have the ability to sort of trigger a minimum stated charge requirement in the real-time market if the situation has gotten a lot worse from the ruck run of the market to the real-time time frame. Again, this would be in the 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock time frame. In the event that we did call a minimum stated charge requirement, either in the ruck process or in the real-time process, we would announce that to stakeholders. And again, I think to Alva's question, we would make sure that storage resources knew that this was a day that this requirement would be imposed and what those requirements for specific resources would be. And the idea here isn't that the operators would just use this when they would use this. The idea here is very much in line with if the conditions in the real-time markets perspired in such a way that had the ruck process been run at that time, it would likely result in infeasibility. Then that's the sort of situation where we would anticipate that the operators would use this initiate a minimum state of charge requirement in the real-time market. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, and then I'll flip back to answer some of these questions. I know we've got a number of them piling up, and I do want, if we can, I'd like to get to some of the questions on the phone as well. As Mike noted, the ISO is not endorsing this as a permanent solution, and frankly, I'm not sure we were ever thinking this was going to be a long-term solution, but we've put even more rigor around that. We are asking for FERC for authority to use this minimum state of charge requirement for a 2-year period, so this would likely be in effect for this summer and next summer. At the same time, the ISO would be beginning a new stakeholder initiative, and this is called the Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative. And the idea there would be to develop a more permanent tool to ensure that the ISO has enough state of charge to meet needs in the real-time market. And then the cornerstone would be that we ensure that storage and other resources that are providing the service would be getting ample compensation for that product that they're providing for the ISO. So this would be a market-based tool. The idea would be that it would replace the minimum state of charge requirement as it was sunset. And then finally, and this is something that we noted in the straw proposal, but I want to reiterate it here, the ISO is committing to reporting on when we are imposing the minimum state of charge requirement in the real-time market. Again, we're going to try to get that information out as close to after our RUC market runs as possible. And then in the event that there are updates in the real-time market, we want to get that information out to stakeholders as well. Okay. So I'm going to flip back here, and I know that I kind of went through a lot of questions before, but I do think this is helpful. We get to hear from a lot of different market participants, and I think we can cover a little bit more ground going through these written questions than the verbal questions, aside from my voice going out. Let's see here. Let me just scroll up to where I think I was before. So I did get a question from Susan Schneider, and she said that summer use of storage between hours ending 11 and 18, can the storage still cycle? Slide 20. Yeah, so I think this is a good, so actually if we advance to slide 21, I think on typical summer days, this is sort of the pattern that we see. The other thing that I put in the final proposal is that the operations team will also have the ability to set a specific window on discharge schedules. So let's just say you had a storage resource and it had a discharge schedule an hour ending 6, and then it also had a discharge schedule an hour ending 18, 19, and 20. Well, the minimum state of charge requirement would only be imposed in the window of hours that the operations team deemed was critical. So if the operations team said, oh, hey, on this day, I think hour ending 18 through hour ending 23 is going to be critical, then those afternoon schedules would have a minimum state of charge requirement imposed on them, while the early morning schedules would not. It's only going to be applied on discharges during these critical hours. I would also say that we've changed our formulation for how we're actually going to be computing the minimum state of charge requirement. Instead of imposing the minimum state of charge requirement at the period when the storage resources are charging, we're going to be imposing it on the hours immediately preceding the discharge schedule. So again, in this case, if you were scheduled to discharge an hour ending 18, 19, 20, you would likely have a minimum state of charge imposed in hour ending 17, 16, and 15, and you wouldn't have them imposed earlier in the day. And again, that's something I did talk about in the paper. So I got another question from Alva Svoboda here. On regulation, does that mean that there will be a buyback of regulation awards in case of MSOC? So yeah, in the event that a storage resource is not able to provide regulation, there could be a buyback of regulation awards. I think that's true. Susan Schneider asked, we need to examine how day-ahead schedule accounts for ancillary service awards. Yeah, so I think, as we're developing our business requirements, if you guys could be engaged in that process, I know you're very engaged, but that process will be specifically how we deal with those ancillary service awards. And I agree. I think that's something we need to flesh out the details on. Yeah, I need Carrie suggesting that we get something to read these comments out. I think that's a good idea, Carrie. So Sergio Dunas, I'm sorry, I butchered your last name, asked if a facility with a 2-hour battery can sell resource adequacy at 50% of PMAX, can Kaiso recognize the resource's extra capacity when making awards, either in the day-ahead or the real-time market? For example, can Kaiso award such a RA resource as scheduled for 2 hours at 100% of PMAX rather than being constrained to take the resource over for 4 hours? Yeah, okay. So for this question, if you have a 2-hour battery and that 2-hour battery is scheduled for discharge, for 2 full hours of discharge in the evening, the minimum state of charge requirement would only be imposed in the 2 hours immediately preceding that schedule. And for the hour immediately preceding it, you'd have an end-of-hour state of charge requirement of 100%, and in the hour preceding that, you'd have a minimum state of charge requirement of 50%. So you can imagine if in earlier hours the resource actually had some state of charge, then that constraint in the first hour, or even for most of the first hour, may not be binding, and it would only be towards the end when the requirements crept up towards 100% that the resource would receive more dispatch instructions to charge. But I think that's a really good question. We did have a few examples of how the minimum state of charge requirement would work in the paper, so I would recommend sort of going through that. And if there's still questions on some of the details, I'm happy to sort of go through that offline. I got a question from Susan Schneider that asked what resources are assumed to count for the 110%. Yeah, so the draft final proposal, had a different trigger than what we're proposing here in the final proposal. This proposal says we're only going to be imposing the minimum state of charge requirement on days when there's a RUC in feasibility. Previously, we had said we had actually had a more complicated formulation of when MSOC requirements would be imposed, and it would be imposed on days where we would actually add a 10% adder onto load, and then we would check how many storage resources we had relative to that target versus non-storage resources. We've sort of done away with all that in the final proposal. So hopefully that's a little bit easier, and we no longer have to deal with the 110% adder onto load. Sergio also asked, given my last question, would a 2-hour resource receive a minimum state of charge for the 2 hours prior? Yeah, I think that's the same sort of question. Susan Schneider asked another question. Does the RUC in feasibility, yes. So Susan's asking if the RUC in feasibility takes the place of the earlier 110% proposal. That is true. Noah asked, Noah Tang, thank you, asked, did a RUC in feasibility increase after ISO removed PIME from the RUC process? I'm not sure. Rahul, if you're online, this might be something you can address. Feel free to chime in. But I don't, Noah, I unfortunately do not know the answer to that, but I'll try to track that down. Susan also asked, does a RUC in feasibility take into account resources not required to bid into the day-ahead market, like VERS? The day-ahead market, the RUC market and the RUC in feasibilities would certainly take VERS into consideration, yes. Michael Volpe asked, the third bullet on slide 23 implies that the minimum state of charge could be implemented in real time without a RUC and feasibility from the prior day-ahead time frame. This means that the MSOC is on call on any given day. Can you clarify? Yeah, Mike, I think that's a really, I think that's a really good question. It does, this authority that we're thinking about does give the operations team the authority to effectively trigger a minimum state of charge requirement and impose those requirements on storage resources on days when there wasn't a RUC and feasibility. The idea there would be, though, that real-time conditions have emerged such that had the RUC process been run with the knowledge of those real-time feasibilities, effectively there would have been or likely would have been a RUC and feasibility. This is just a sort of way for the ISO to say, hey, look, we know that, when we're thinking about conditions in the day-ahead market, things can change between day-ahead and real-time. This is one last opportunity for the operations team to say, oh, things have gotten really bad in real-time. We've had another fire, causing problems on, a large transmission line. We've potentially had a generator or two drop off for a large amount of capacity. We think we're really going to be in trouble for meeting our evening loads. We need something in place to ensure that we have some state of charge from storage resources. It's not meant to be, hey, today's February 23rd, let's go ahead and flip on the MSOC requirement and see what happens. It really is meant to be sort of a last-ditch emergency type situation that emerges in the real-time market compared to the RUC process. But I do appreciate that question. Alva asked another question. He said, do you have concerns about the minimum state of charge requirement being imposed this summer without battery default energy bids? I think we do. This obviously raises some questions and concerns about potential for storage resources to, in effect, be able to exercise market power. And if those storage resources did exercise market power, that could mean higher prices across the entire grid. I would say this, the ISO and the Department of Market Monitoring have the ability to refer storage resources or any resources that they suspect of anti-competitive behavior. I think, we will be monitoring the situation. DMM has been briefed about these tools being put in place, and I think they will be sort of on the lookout for sort of bidding behavior from storage resources that is irregular. And similarly, our market validation team will also be looking for that kind of behavior. So I think there will be additional scrutiny on those storage resources, particularly since we're going to have so much of them. We're going to have this constraint in place on some specific days, and they could potentially be pivotal and exercise market power. But I think that's a really good question and certainly a concern for the ISO. Mike Kramick asked two questions. Question number one is an observation. 23 days of RUC and feasibility doesn't sound like emergency conditions. So my response to that would be that, these are days when our day-ahead market couldn't solve, couldn't find a feasible solution where supply would equal demand. And that to us is extremely concerning. So the fact that this happened 23 days during 2020 might be indicative of other conditions. On 2019 and 2018, obviously this happened much less frequently. The second question is a 2-hour battery follow-up question. Will the ISO enforce the energy constraint to PMAX or just to RA value? Unfortunately, we're not able to, our software is not able to control to an RA value right now. I believe we're going to be setting this constraint to whatever the discharge awards are for the storage resource if it is awarded a discharge schedule. Okay. That concludes the written questions. I will go ahead and take questions from the phone at this time, which I'm sure there are many.
Sure. Moving on to the first caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Dave. Carrie Bentley from the Western Power Trading Forum. That was a lot. That was a lot of information very rapidly, and I appreciate the fact that you're able to get through a lot of questions, but maybe that's indicative of needing more time on a call rather than a new format where people can just chat in. I don't think I've ever written so fast before. So, all right, going back to my question, I think some of them were answered, which was good, but generally at a high level, and I think a lot of the questions got to this, is that it's some of the things that you are saying are implementation details are incredibly important to the potential for storage to make money. And at a time where the CPUC is literally begging load-serving entities to sign contracts to increase their output to get online by this summer and by next summer, it's really counterproductive, I think, to not have good answers to some of these questions. To, for example, not being able to clearly articulate whether it's going to be 1 day or 23 days, because we don't know if the 23 days were due to PIM, or, PIME, and RUC insufficiency or not, to not be able to really get a good answer on the interaction between ancillary services and energy and the likelihood of buybacks. And then the very, very scary bullet point at the end of page 23. ISO will have the ability to cancel or initiate MSOC tool in the real-time market. Now, storage operators or anyone new to the market may not know what that means, and that may sound pretty innocuous. But to those of us who've been around for a while, we know what that means. That means operators are going to use this whenever they want, and we have no control over it, and we have no idea when that will happen. So it's not 23 days or 1 day. It's really whenever operators feel the least bit shaky in the market. And the financial consequences of that are unknown. So I just want to express some extreme disappointment with this proposal. I know you have made it better in some ways by giving it a sunset date, but in other ways, by giving operators this additional control, I think you've made it much worse. And I'm wondering whether that third bullet point is really needed.
Yeah, I think we've taken the stakeholder feedback very seriously. We've had discussions at the highest level of management at the ISO, and we feel like this proposal, we certainly are intending to use this on as few days as possible. If we have another year like 2019, my assumption would be that this gets triggered maybe once, maybe twice in the year total. Obviously, if this is a year like 2020, where situations and weather conditions are very extreme, we might see this used much more frequently, which I think would be appropriate in light of what happened last year. But this is sort of, the balance that the ISO can strike right now in developing a policy that won't impact or that will impact storage resources as little as possible, while making sure that we do have state of charge on these absolute most critical days, where if we didn't have it, we'd have the possibility of dropping load on our system. And, we feel like we need that authority.
Yeah, and I've said this before, that the Kaiso's feelings about what they need on constrained days are not the same as actually modeling what would happen if this tool were in place. And we have literally asked from the beginning, can you show us some example days? Can you show us how this would work with AS? And we're now at and you've said it's coming, and we're now at the final draft proposal, and there isn't even a solid, realistic example. And I appreciate, though, that you have done improvements to make this better, and I don't know whether we will protest this at FERC or not at this point in time, but I think but there's some trade-offs here, and this is a really scary one to me. And I just want to make sure everyone knows that, you know, we are very pleased that the Kaiso has listened to stakeholders, and we appreciate that you've attempted to come to a compromise, but a compromise theoretical position is not a substitute for data or analysis. And I'm just going to say one other quick thing, because I was queued up for Carl, and then, you know, it'll be very fast, I promise. But saying things like generators are going to take the money and run, and blaming the dysfunctional monthly RA system and the misalignment between the CPUC and Kaiso on issues, and blaming that on generators is a very inappropriate tone. And again, telling generators that they don't want them to take the money and run simply because of issues with taking a week's planned outage and not knowing how to fit a week's planned outage in a monthly RA program is incredibly inappropriate. And again, Gabe, this is not a criticism of you, but I just found that to be strikingly rude. And I hope the Kaiso continues their trend of listening to stakeholders, and they've been entered almost every initiative I've heard the last 2 weeks with this very kumbaya attitude. But then sometimes, I don't know, I think some of these underlying biases show. And I just want to say, storage resources are not trying to take money or game the system and run. They're trying to operate in a challenging market. Generators are not trying to take money and run. They're trying to operate in a challenging environment, and everyone's trying to do the best they can. So any sort of tone that implies that people are trying to game the system, I do find a little offensive. I don't think the Kaiso is trying to game the system. I think you guys are doing the best you can, and I hope we get the benefit of the doubt as well. Thanks, Gabe.
Okay, a lot of, yeah, thanks for the feedback. We'll take that back and consider it. I appreciate it. Operator, next caller, please.
Sure. Caller line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Kathleen.
Thanks, Gabe, and thanks for confirming. For the sake of brevity, and I know you've answered a lot of technical questions, and I feel like, I mean, at least my feeling is we kind of, a lot of the stakeholders and you, and there's been discourse back and forth over multiple meetings in the last few months that have kind of beaten the merits of this to death almost. So I'd like to say that I agree with what other stakeholders have raised concerns on the merits of this proposal, but I want to raise a different one just to make sure that we're expanding the dialogue and not just repeating things. So what I wanted to raise and then, you know, ask for some additional thoughts from the Kaiso on is I'm really struggling with policy making that conflicts with final rules out of FERC policy processes. And I think a part of my concern there is that when we go through these like extensive notice of proposed rulemakings and get to a final rule at FERC on these complex issues, including storage participation models specifically, where Order 841 was the culmination of that. That is that takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. There are technical conferences involved in that process. And regulatory work, I understand it has its uncertainties and things evolve over time as issues are identified and changes are needed. But this is a very recent order and one that these issues have been litigated, for lack of a better word, quite extensively. In fact, in the final rule, there's 5 pages on who under organized electric markets has the state of charge management obligation or role and responsibility in this final rule, 5 pages. So as a regulatory person, I receive final rules like that and I read and go, okay, great, there's a well-expanded record on this topic. There's been comments back and forth. We've heard from RTOs, ISOs. We've heard from generator owners. And FERC has come up with, here is what is the final rule on how the participation model is required to perform. And just not to, and I know I've raised these in my written comments, but I really don't I don't want this to get swept under the rug, that there is an entire part of this record and in the rule that specifically acknowledges that this concern that I think you guys are trying to create some barriers around, but it's that there are these reliability challenges and you need to prepare and perform to them. Paragraph 250 of the final rule I would point you to directly is the Commission determination on this point. And the Commission's determination on this point is still that electric storage resources are the people that are managing that state of charge. And they go further to say that they believe that the proper way to incentivize, and I'll just say they believe that the flexibility will ensure sufficient visibility of a resource using the participation model for electric storage resources to safeguard operational reliability and market integrity. And that visibility, what they're talking about, is that by having access to telemetry and other information, the ISO and RTO can have better information as to where the storage is. It doesn't contemplate in the final rule enforcing that, but it does contemplate that you have that visibility and you can respond accordingly. They reiterate, after discussing these reliability challenges that have been raised, that self-managing electric storage resources is their requirement for a participation model. And in the Kaiso market, that's non-generating resource model. So this NGR model is required to allow suppliers to manage their state of charge. And I would really like some additional clarity on your plan for fighting a final rule.
Thanks, Kathleen. It sounds like we're getting into some questionable legal debates, perhaps. So I'm not sure if David wants to take up the mic on that one, but I don't feel like I'm in a position right now to answer those questions.
Sure. I mean, what I'll say is that, Order 841, I do, have seen some of the material you're referencing. I think, our view is that, that's Order 841. It's about market participation, and that's fine. But we're talking about RA here, which is a storage resource providing RA. That's a higher sort of obligation than just a resource participating in the market as a, market resource. And so that's why we don't see Order 841 as prohibiting, the proposal here.
David, thank you for that, and I appreciate that. And just, I think my request is for you to consider if you could just take this back and do some additional thinking on this. And one other thing, as you're doing that, I would, I'm sure you're aware of, but within the concept of this order, capacity requirements and eligibility to participate in capacity as well as in the energy and AS is a part of this order. And so I think a reasonable person, a reasonable mind would look at that and not consider RA being an element that would make 841 no longer applicable. I think that is a reasonable read, so I just would flag that for you. Part of the reason I'm raising this is I do think that there are elements in this proposal that have merit. I'm looking forward to talking about your proposals on the import piece, but it would be unfortunate if something that has merit that could improve reliability fails just on the face value because it's another element that's non-severable is directly in conflict with a federal, with FERC's existing policy that at least our read does govern its participation in the market. So thank you. Appreciate your thoughts and you thinking about it.
So thanks for those comments, Kathleen. We do appreciate those. Okay, operator, next caller, please.
Sure. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. This is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Can you guys hear me okay?
Hey, Susan, we can.
Yeah, okay. Just a couple things. Having to deal with the chat, I'll tell you, is absolutely frustrating. because you're trying to type things and listen at the same time. And for somebody who did a lot of typing in there, it meant I could not listen that well with what your answers were to the other people and sometimes to my earlier questions. So I'll tell you, that was actually a little frustrating. And the whack-a-mole trying to, run back and forth between the summer preparedness and this one is sort of is another echo of trying to run back and forth between this initiative and the hybrid resources initiative. So I would encourage you, if you're going to throw these things in more than one forum, to make sure you repeat all the details in both of them. Otherwise, we're having to run back and forth between them. So anyway, I just wanted to bring up and add, just to elaborate. That's my apologize. That's my whining on the process here. But the issue of ancillary services, and I know, Gabe, you and I have gone back and forth a little bit on this, but I'm a little disturbed with the idea that in the day-ahead optimization for energy storage, where storage is offered, and how that fits into the minimum state of charge, when, the idea that if a resource has ancillary services award in, say, hours, 15, 16, something like that, when you're getting into that evening period, and it turns out, I guess the way that the optimization works is it just assumes that the resource state of charge at the end of the hour is the same as what it was at the beginning. And if the resource is a reserve kind of resource, then, okay, that would kind of make sense, because maybe it's only used, in order to discharge in real time if you really need it, but it might actually discharge. So I think it could result in infeasible day-ahead schedules for the discharging. Say if they were going to be discharging in the later into the evening, they're not going to have this. If they discharge when they're providing ancillary services, then they're going to not have that charge later in the evening. So how is that all going to, first of all, that's a problem right there, I think, and it seems an odd thing not to have been resolved. And second, how is that going to work with this minimum state of charge? Are you going to not tell, if a resource is providing ancillary services in the hours before they're supposed to discharge, or they're scheduled to discharge based on their day-ahead schedule, are you going to not have them discharge so they're ready to discharge later, even though they're providing ancillary services and they're supposed to be able to discharge if you need them? Can you explain just how that's all supposed to work together?
Yeah, Susan, I think these are really great questions. You said, I think, obviously a lot to unpack there, but one of the things you said is, how hasn't this been resolved yet? And I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head there. The whole point is, the ISO doesn't have a whole lot of storage that we manage right now, and we don't have a whole lot of these, situations, which we're certainly going to have next summer, occurring in the market where we do have these kind of issues. But I think you're right that, you've pointed out that there's the day-ahead market, when it schedules resources for ancillary services, it doesn't take into consideration any reduction in state of charge from the hour before or during an ancillary service award to the hour after an ancillary service award. And I know that is one of the items that they're looking at in the day-ahead enhancements initiative, and I fully expect that they will come up with a solution there. And unfortunately, that's just another instance of saying, oh, hey, we're dealing with a storage issue in yet another place. But that is current resolution that we have for this problem. In the meantime, I think you're right. I think there is a danger, and storage resource scheduling coordinators should be aware of this and actively looking at bids, that if you get awarded a very large regulation award in hours preceding hours when you have a discharge of all of your state of charge, there could be a conflict there where, you wouldn't be able to provide the ancillary services and have that state of charge in those hours immediately before the discharge schedule. If, however, those ancillary service awards were, a couple hours before the discharge schedule, I don't think that's an issue with the way that we've currently configured the minimum state of charge requirement. And then the other thing would be is if the discharge was, say, for 50% of the capacity of the battery, obviously then you'd have plenty of extra capacity to provide ancillary services in the hours when you're discharging and the hours previous to the discharge.
Well, I guess I don't understand if you've got a discharge schedule for the evening hours and you're providing ancillary services, say, for 2 or 3 hours before that, how it is not a problem, even reliability problem for the Kaiso. Well, first of all, will the minimum stated charge still allow those resources to discharge right before while they're providing ancillary services, even if it impairs the state of charge for their discharge schedule that comes right after?
Well, there's a rule that we have that states, and I believe this is in the tariff, that storage resources have to have 30 minutes of state of charge to be able to provide ancillary services. So as long as you have the 30 minutes of state of charge, you would be able to provide that service to the ISO. But if you didn't, you couldn't provide that service.
Well,
additionally, I'm sorry.
I don't think you answered the question exactly, or maybe I didn't ask it properly. But my question is, if you so let's say there's 3 hours of ancillary services and 4 hours of discharge. Okay. Well, is in the ancillary services piece of that, in those hours, will this minimum state of charge allow those resources when they're providing ancillary services to discharge? So say they're charged at that point, but it will allow them to discharge in those ancillary services hours if they then couldn't meet their discharge hours that come right after. And I'm obviously it's a simplistic example because things could be different from hour to hour, but just in that example, would the minimum state of charge allow them to discharge as ancillary services resources in those hours before the discharge schedule starts? Would there be a restriction there, or how would that work?
I think the answer is no. The market requirement would say, let's just say you had a 4-hour battery and you're scheduled to discharge consecutively for 4 hours later in the day. You're an hour ending 16. An hour ending 17, you have your first hour of a 4-hour schedule. So in that hour, you have a requirement that's imposed by the minimum state of charge requirement if this is a day where there's a RUC feasibility. So we're only
let's assume it applies. Okay, yeah, fine.
Yeah. So let's assume we're on one of these days when it applies. Then the real-time market would be dispatching the resource such that the market has a full 100% state of charge at the end of that hour. If you started the hour at 75% state of charge, then effectively no, you couldn't get scheduled to discharge anything because every single interval you'd have to charge that resource. If you're at 100% state of charge at the beginning of the hour, you could be discharged because you could discharge in the middle of the hour and then you could recharge by the end of the hour, so you'd have sufficient state of charge going into the next hour.
Okay, so with the minimum state of charge, so there's the resources, and I said, let's just assume a very simple example, 3 hours of ancillary services, let's call it spinning reserve, and 4 hours of discharge after that. Okay, so during the spinning reserve hours, you're saying the resource could be dispatched to provide, to discharge, to provide energy from the spinning reserve if necessary. But would the ICE only dispatch it to do that if it could charge up by the end of the hour? And would that be true for each of the 3 hours or just the end of the third hour? Or how would that be? Because then they're going to be charging during what could be expensive time. Yeah,
so for spin, the requirement isn't that you have 30 minutes worth of the product, 30 minutes worth of state of charge. You'd have 15 minutes worth of state of charge. So as long as you met your 15-minute obligation for state of charge in the first hour of your requirement and the second hour of the requirement, you'd have no problem meeting your minimum state of charge as well.
Well, because ISO is the one dispatching the resource. It's not like the resource is saying, oh, I have to do this because then I need to do this. Isn't the Kaiso the one sending the dispatch instruction?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, so if the resource has a period of ancillary services before a period of discharge, I don't want to take up more time than I'm going to leave time for other people, but if the resource is scheduled to discharge, let's just call it the last hour before, has ancillary services the last hour before that 4-hour discharge schedule. So if they discharge anything in that hour, if they don't, by the end of the hour, recharge it again, they're not going to make their 4-hour discharge schedule that's coming up, right?
Well, I think this just goes back to what we just said. If you we're in the situation where you discharge at the beginning of the hour, yeah, you could recharge in the second half of the hour and be ready to go for your...
Is that what the Kaiso would dispatch the resource to do? Because they're following Kaiso dispatch instructions. So if the Kaiso is scheduled, it orders the resource that's providing spinning, in this case, spinning reserve, to discharge at the beginning of the hour, would the Kaiso make sure that the resource is charged at the end of the hour? Is that what the Kaiso dispatch instructions would do as part of this proposal?
Yes, that's exactly.
Okay, then in that hour, okay, and this is the hour right before the discharge period. Those prices could be very high in those hours.
Yeah, correct.
But the resource would still have to pay that. You can see this is really, it's hard to figure out how this all works together. So, all right, so because it's not the resource that has the responsibility to be charged by the end of the hour. The Kaiso has to make sure that happens so that the resource can meet the discharge schedule for the 4 hours later, right?
Yeah, exactly, yes. And that's the whole point of the requirement is we know we've got a period where we are going to be relying on these storage resources. We want to make sure they're charged. So that's exactly what the requirement is.
Okay. So if the resource is providing ancillary service or, sort of spinning reserve and has to discharge for more than just the beginning of the hour, let's say they have to, because you need them, as they're providing that reserve service, you need them to provide energy as well, so that it's not possible. So you're saying that they, even though you might need it for spinning reserve for longer than just the beginning of the hour, or let's say you're getting close to the end of that hour and you needed a spinning reserve to provide that service, you're not going to dispatch it to do that because it would interfere with the discharge schedule that comes right after.
Correct.
Okay. So, well, there are a lot of policy issues around that too. But okay, let me get off here and let some other people talk. But there's there's a question of feasibility of this at day ahead schedule, forgetting about what happens during real time. So, okay, I'm done. Sorry.
No, I think those are really good questions, Susan, and I do appreciate them. And I think those are very much in the same vein of the questions we received on the chat panel earlier. So I do appreciate taking some time to work through some of those details. So I appreciate that. Okay, operator, next caller, please.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead. Caller, please unmute the device from your end and ask your question. Your line has been unmuted.
Well, maybe we move on to the next caller.
There are no further questions in the queue.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Bridget.
Great. Thank you, Gabe. So now we're going to move on to the backstop capacity procurement. And so my plan is to go through these slides, and so if you have questions, feel free to enter them into the chat, and Isabella will read them at the end, and then we can also take phone questions. So as most folks are aware, that Kaiso has backstop authority to CPM for a number of scenarios. And so for this policy, we are seeking to modify the third scenario to designate a local collective deficiency to recognize not only capacity needs in local areas, but also energy needs. So as the resource mix is changing and we have a number of gas-fired units retiring in local areas, folks have been wanting and have been procuring more availability and use-limited resources in local areas. And so we have started to expand our local capacity technical studies to evaluate how this changing resource mix might affect reliability needs in local areas. And so currently we've been performing these studies, but we don't have the backstop authority to ensure that these limitations are met and respected. And so in this proposal, we're seeking to expand that existing tariff authority to trigger not only on a capacity shortage, but also an energy shortage. So if we move to the next slide. So in the draft final proposal, we were a little light on the details on what we meant by the local energy sufficiency evaluation. And so this information has been available in prior papers, but we, in the final proposal, responded to stakeholder questions and provided some more details and reminders around what we actually meant by the local energy sufficiency evaluation. So as part of the annual local capacity technical studies, the ISO has started to develop and perform detailed hourly load and resource analysis to determine energy needs in addition to capacity needs in local areas. And so in these local capacity studies, we typically plan for the peak hour condition, which when we had a gas-fired fleet, if you planned for the peak hour, it was a safe assumption that you would have sufficient energy in subsequent hours. But as we procure things like batteries and DR to meet these peak energy needs, we can run into a situation where we have the peak hours covered, but then may have insufficient energy in other periods or insufficient energy to actually charge the battery in these local areas. And so we're expanding these technical studies to do that more complete energy evaluation to make sure that we have not only the peak hours covered, but also sort of those tail hours are met with adequate energy and capacity. So in existing studies, so for example, in the Santa Clara local sub-area, we provided charts and graphs that outlined what was the needed duration of things like storage and how much energy was needed to meet the energy needs to help inform procurement of these availability limited resources. And so we have been publishing these reports and these energy evaluations, but we, again, don't have the existing tariff authority to make sure that those needs are covered. And so in this policy, we're seeking to expand the tariff authority to designate a local collective deficiency if any area or sub-area fails this evaluation, and allow the ISO to backstop following cure periods to ensure that sufficient energy is there to cover the reliability needs in these local areas. So there's the next slide. So again, the Kaiso speaks and stakeholders have generally supported expanding CPM authority to ensure energy sufficiency in local areas. So again, with this increased procurement of available limited resources to meet local area needs, the Kaiso has expanded our local technical studies to consider not only capacity, but also energy sufficiency in each local and area and sub-area. And so we're seeking CPM authority to designate and trigger a local collective deficiency if any local area or sub-area fails this energy sufficiency evaluation, which will ensure that we have sufficient megawatts and megawatt hours to meet reliability needs. And so unlike other parts of the final proposal, which are intended to go into effect this summer, this CPM authority will be implemented this fall for our year 2022. Next slide. So in response to stakeholder feedback, again, while feedback was light, majority were in support of this extension of CPM authority. So folks like CalCCA, CPUC, DMM, Middle River Power, 6 cities, and SCE were generally supportive. And folks thought this was sort of a common sense expansion of CPM authority in the face of the changing resource mix. However, stakeholders did have a few questions and clarifications they wanted made, which we made in the final paper. So to highlight those here, stakeholders wanted to ensure that the requirements are clear up front in terms of what the energy sufficiency needs were in these areas, so that LSEs and the eventual central procurement entity can direct procurement to reduce CPM risk. So in response, the Kaiso will continue to outline the requirements for all applicable local area and sub-areas, and these will be clearly described in the annual LCR report through charts and graphs, with the energy needs during the peak as well as year-round conditions. And these will be released prior to the beginning of LSE procurement, so that folks will know what the energy needs are in these local areas. Additionally, the Kaiso has submitted a proposal in the CPUC's Track 3B1 proceedings to request the CPUC use these hourly load and resource analysis from the LCR studies to direct procurement of available limited resources in local areas to maintain alignment of our requirements across the Kaiso and other LRAs. Next slide. And then PG&E and SDG&E wanted additional details on the energy sufficiency evaluation, which we provided in the paper. And then PG&E also wanted clarification on how the energy sufficiency evaluation in local areas differs from the sufficiency evaluations we are proposing in phase 2 of this proceeding. And so we want to clarify that the sufficiency evaluation we're proposing in phase 2 is what we would call the portfolio evaluation, and this is really about evaluating system needs and whether or not the shown portfolio has the ability to meet energy sufficiency in all hours to meet system level requirements, whereas this energy sufficiency evaluation is specifically for local areas and local area energy needs. And so while they are similar in that they're testing to see if we have sufficient energy to meet needs in all hours, this CPM authority is specifically for local areas and will be a local collective deficiency, whereas the portfolio evaluation and subsequent CPM authority will be worked out further in phase 2, but that is definitely targeted towards system requirements and not local areas. Finally, SDG&E wanted further details on how LSEs or the ISO will be able to identify what resources could cure the identified deficiencies. And so the ISO will continue to use the RA deficiency report that is published in mid-November to describe how each local area and sub-area capacity as well as energy needs were not met, and to inform local load-serving entities of how much from each resource is not shown as RA capacity as is done today. So again, we'll continue to use these deficiency reports to identify what resources in local areas are still available to contract with, so that folks know what resources are available to cure these energy deficiencies. So with that, I will pause for questions. So feel free to use the chat function or enter the question queue.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So if you have any questions, you can enter the phone queue by pressing #2.
I see one question. I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, this is Catalin. I just want to make one clarification for everybody to understand. The ISO has authority to designate local CPM. We do not make a designation between individual and collective. So everybody has an assignment. This energy would not be an individual assignment, so no individual LSE has to comply with it. However, at the end, when we get all the showings and we put them together, they all together need to meet this. It's just a choice of the word collective used here. I just want to let everybody know that after we make an evaluation that there is a missing resource that we need to procure, that resource, the cost of that resource first goes to the individual deficient LSEs, and then the second part goes to collective. So if you are not meeting your individual needs, you could end up, paying for this additional CPM on individual basis because you did not met your overall local requirement, not because you have to comply with this energy need. So hopefully everybody understood that part. I just want to make sure that everybody understands that the ISO does not choose to designate individual or choose to designate collective. We just choose to designate local. And the first local goes to individual deficient LSEs, and after we fill them all up, the remaining part goes to collective. So I just wanted to make a difference between the words that we're using here, collective versus, an individual. Thank you.
Thanks, Catalin.
I see one question on the phone line. Call, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. This is Catherine Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just have an administrative question, I guess, to some extent. So I appreciate, thanks Bridget and thanks Catalin for the context. I want to share a little bit of Vistra's thinking of where we're coming from on a lot of these elements, but I think this one fits in the bucket, and I have a request specific to it. So the concern that I have is that the risks, the commercial risks, the administrative risks, transactional contract, all those risks are hard to weigh and evaluate with this proposal until we get some sense out of the CPUC process as to what, at least conceptually, the 3B2 framework might look like. The timing in that process is we're expecting a proposed decision in around May, and then I'm anticipating some kind of final decision in June. The timing of this element going to the board and being finalized prior to that, I think that, at least for me, is the primary challenge for us being able to evaluate the merits of it and whether or not we as a supplier can support it. You could boil it down to as simple as, I'm not sure what's going to happen because I'm not sure if charging requirements are going to become a part of the framework that's adopted by the CPUC up front in the procurement process. So I'm not sure if this is a backstop or if this is really, or in the alternative, if they're not adopted, if this is truly the primary procurement for that energy. And that changes the risk assessment, that changes the way that we would evaluate the proposal, if it's a backstop versus really the first procurer. And so my request for the Kaiso is just, I urge you to consider moving this element to one of the later phases of the project to give us time to get some clarity on that, even if it's even if it's 2A, which I think you're trying to take to the board in May, and if it goes after that proposed decision, that would be helpful. Best case scenario, you would take it after the decision and we have some sense of what that 3B2 framework will look like, but that would be a huge help to kind of just help improve some certainty around these changes.
Yeah, thank you for that. This is ISO. We view this a little different, I guess, than what you just entailed here. This is not an individual LSE responsibility. This is an overall responsibility for the LSEs to pay attention when they're purchasing resources. What we're trying to say is that today we can make sure we can meet the peak demand on that day, but we are not sure we can meet 2 hours later, 3 hours later, 5 hours later demand. And by us showing the curves and the needs of those areas and sub-areas on a peak day and throughout the year, everybody should be aware of the resources, of the pool of resources that are needed in those areas and sub-areas. And we just can't meet reliability without the correct pool of resources. It is treated just like the way we treat effectiveness factors. You can go buy any unit that you want. You don't have to buy the most effective unit. So this would be similar. You can go buy any energy resource you want, but to come back and the pool doesn't meet the local requirement, we can make a CPM call for that. And we believe that is needed as soon as possible, and because we might not be able to meet reliability needs at other hours other than the peak. So we believe this needs to move forward as soon as possible and not to wait for by LSC responsibility or something that PUC may impose at a later time. Thank you.
Thanks, Kylan. Just as a quick follow-up, because I want to clarify that I'm not suggesting that you wait for the time the CPUC makes a decision to adopt this framework, whether that is including an energy product or an energy requirement, whether that's including the charging requirement. All I'm suggesting is that there would be greater certainty and the ability to evaluate what this proposal would potentially really do from our perspective, from a commercial side, if we have more certainty on if that's in that framework or not. So, and I just given the fact that your proposal is to take this to the board in March versus a proposed decision would be in May, that's really only a 2-month, tops 3-month lag. And so I completely understand. I'm sympathetic. All I'm asking is for some consideration that maybe 3 months delay so that we can have some certainty when that goes to the board about what this would look like in practice would help me, in my opinion, as a stakeholder.
Okay, thanks for that feedback. Are there any other callers in the queue?
There are no further questions in the queue.
Okay. And I don't see any in the chat.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any in the chat either, Bridget. So if there are no further questions, I think we can move on to next steps. Okay, so comments on the final proposal are due March 9th, and then again, to reiterate what was said earlier today, we do plan to seek board approval on the phase 1 element during the March 24th through 25th meeting. And then as far as comments, the template is now available out on the Stakeholder Initiative webpage, so you can get to it through this link here or just by going to the website. So we do have about 15 minutes. If there's anything we wanted to circle back to, we can take maybe a couple more questions now. So if you have any questions, you can enter the queue by pressing #2. We'll give it a second to see if anybody enters. Is there anyone in the queue, Shreyas?
There are no questions in the queue as of now.
Okay, then that concludes today's stakeholder call. Thank you all for your participation, and thank you all for your feedback on today's call, specifically utilizing the chat feature. We do appreciate the feedback, and we will take it back to discuss internally for consideration. Thank you again for participating, and have a great rest of your day.